Bob Herbert's OpEd.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. At the close of the Constitutional Convention of 1787, a woman supposedly said to Ben Franklin, "Well, doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy?" Franklin is said to have replied, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." That is no less true today than it was more than 2 centuries ago. And right now, one of the fundamental threats to our republic is the continuing unconscionable assault on the voting rights of our citizens. I'll talk about this with my guest, Sean Morales-Doyle, who serves as counsel in the democracy program at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming in. I really appreciate it. So let's start off with the more or less clear-cut efforts at suppression. We've got the 2020 the 2020 presidential election already underway, which is kind of incredible.
Yeah.
What are you guys at the democracy program concerned about or focusing on right now?
I mean, one of the most recent sort of crises, I suppose, that we're focusing on is a legislative effort in Florida to basically roll back or seriously limit the impact of a constitutional amendment in Florida that was passed in November, which ended the practice of permanent disenfranchisement for people with felony convictions in Florida and restored voting rights to everybody who had completed their sentences, which was thought to be something like 1.4 million people.
Right.
And then just last week, the Florida legislature passed a law which is on its way to the governor, which would require people to pay back any outstanding civil legal obligations that they may have before they get their rights restored, which will have a huge impact on it will seriously limit the number of people that will actually get their voting rights back as a result of Amendment 4, which is really kind of an attack on democracy in 2 ways. One is just the obvious fact that people's voting rights are being limited, but the other is that this was a change to Florida law that came as a result of a democratic act. There was a ballot initiative. There was 800,000 petition signatures to put it there, and then it was on the ballot and it was approved by 64% of Florida voters. You know, millions, more than 5 million people voted for this thing in November, and now the politicians are figuring out a way to undermine that.
So in addition to thwarting Voting Rights Act, they're undermining the will of the people in terms of this ballot measure.
Right.
Wow. The things that we have been looking at for the past several years, voter ID and voter intimidation, are they still alive and well?
They are. I mean, I think, thankfully, what we've seen in the last couple of years is that there's a countervailing trend as well of expansive movement. And unfortunately, it's sort of a divide among the states in the country. There are states that we see continuing down the path that we've seen for the last decade of, restrictive voter ID laws or all types of different ways of suppressing the vote. But there are also a lot of states that are moving the other direction and have really embraced expanding democracy as something that they want to pursue. And so we've actually this past year, I think, seen more of those kinds of legislative actions than the opposite. But it really just depends on where you are in the country, and we're sort of seeing a division in our nation about how we're going to approach democracy.
So we've done a couple of shows on extreme gerrymandering, and it looks like there's been some significant movement in that area. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. When I moved to New York to come work at the Brennan Center, actually I was moving from Chicago a couple years ago, and I got the man who was moving me here, the man who I hired to move me across the country, when he found out, he asked me why I was moving to New York. I told him I was going to work at the Brennan Center, and he sort of launched into a long conversation about how terrible partisan gerrymandering was and about the various cases going on, et cetera. I think that we are seeing movement on that, in part because of direct democracy, in part because of ballot initiatives, because I think the people in this country are really paying attention to these issues in a way that they haven't before. Democracy has become an issue that, not just voting rights lawyers, but movers and everybody else is
Right.
paying attention to. And we're seeing some changes there. There's an effort in New Hampshire to create a redistricting commission that could happen any day now, and we've seen movement in a number of other states as well.
It's not at all hyperbole to say it's a direct assault on democracy. That's exactly what it is. But we're nearly 2 decades into the 21st century, and this is still happening.
Yeah.
Why is that? Who benefits? Why is there so much energy behind this widespread assault on democracy?
I mean, some of it is just people trying to hold on to the power that they have, right? I mean, incumbents have an interest in keeping the system in place that got them there. And so some of it is just sort of trying to keep a check on the expansion of voting rights in any way in order to hold on to power. A lot of it, unfortunately, is partisan politics. It's folks that are worried about changes in the populace leading to their party losing out or
Right.
them losing power, and they're reacting to that. And that also is related to xenophobia. When we see all of these claims of non-citizens on the rolls and sort of false rhetoric about widespread voter fraud, that may be motivated from a politician's standpoint to like try to keep certain people from voting who they think won't vote for them, but the way it finds its the way they get traction with that is that we have a problem with racism and xenophobia in this country, and
Right.
so people hear those cues about non-citizens on the rolls, and they respond in a way that allows people to justify restrictive voter ID laws and things that we don't actually need, and so I think some of it is a sort of false rhetoric that really gets people charged up in a way that as a nation we just haven't yet. And maybe we never will come to terms with the sort of underlying racism and xenophobia that we have.
So, you mentioned the racism and xenophobia, and that immediately calls to mind the decision by the Roberts Court, the Supreme Court, to essentially cripple the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Can you explain what the court did and why that was such a destructive move?
Sure. So in 2013, in a case called Shelby County v. Holder, the Supreme Court, what they did was they struck down a provision in Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, or 4B, which actually then ends up making Section 5 inoperable. And I'll explain that. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is the part of the Voting Rights Act that subjected certain parts of the country to pre-clearance. So before they could change their voting laws or voting practices, they had to get clearance from the federal government to ensure that what they were doing wasn't going to have a racially discriminatory impact.
Because they had a history of discriminating.
Exactly, and that that includes right here in New York, and but also in many states in the South. There was a long history of doing things that were not explicitly racist in order to limit the voting rights of people of color, and so they had to go get approval from the federal government before they would change their laws. And in 2013, the Supreme Court said, Congress hasn't given us enough of a background of that historical discrimination to justify this continuing. We can't say that the right jurisdictions are being chosen for this type of preclearance, and so we're going to invalidate the formula for deciding who's covered. And as a result, now nobody's covered. And now it's incumbent on voting rights lawyers in the advocacy community to affirmatively go after these discriminatory practices instead of having a check on them from the beginning, where the states and counties would have to go and seek approval from the Department of Justice before they would move forward with a policy change.
Now, you mentioned that parts of New York as well were covered by the Voting Rights Act. So we're here in New York. It's a liberal state, a liberal city, and yet you have written, and this is a quote, I love this quote, that New York has some of the most retrograde voting laws and practices in the nation. How can that be?
Yeah.
What are some of the things that are so wrong about the voting system in New York City and New York State?
Well, so there is that history that I just talked about going way back of racial discrimination, and some of that we still see the manifestation of some of that. New York by law does not provide people on parole the right to vote. That's a result of a long racist history of felony disenfranchisement. But sort of in elections administration, New York, until this legislative session, this changed, but New York had no early voting. 38 states had early voting. New York doesn't have automatic voter registration. New York has very unique and laws about changing your party affiliation. So you have to change your party affiliation months before an election, and then you can't vote in a primary if you're not affiliated with the party. Any of us who voted in November in New York saw the long lines because of all kinds of polling location issues and machine problems. Fact is, I moved here from, as I said, I moved here from Illinois, from Chicago, and it was kind of shocking to me when I got here and voted for the first time.
Which is pretty funny given the history that Chicago has had, but now New York, I guess, could take its place.
Yes, I mean, in Chicago, we've had early voting for years, and we have, in a city that's a third of the size of New York, like 52 different places that you can go vote, and you don't have to vote in your neighborhood during early voting. You can vote anywhere in the city. And New York is just now going to have early voting for the first time ever in November, and the New York City Board of Elections announced that they were planning 38 polling locations for early voting.
In a city this size?
Yes. And
that's bizarre.
And it won't be, my understanding is that it won't be voting centers, so you won't be able to vote at any of these locations in the city. You have to vote at the one in your part of the city, which really undermines one of the huge benefits of early voting in places like Chicago. I lived on the South Side, but I worked downtown, and I could just walk out of my office and walk down the street and vote anytime during the weeks before the election, and we won't be able to do that here.
So for New Yorkers who do want to participate in early voting, how will they do it? One, how will they find the location that they're supposed to vote at if they want to vote? How many days early can they do it? And is that all they have to do, just show up?
Yeah, so yes, all they have to do is show up. They have to show up, at least for the time being, in the right place.
Right.
Around the state, it will vary a little bit because because there's some discretion of the county as to how to do this. But in New York City, as I said, right now, the Board of Elections has planned 38 locations. And so you'll have to go to the location that you're assigned to. There'll be 9 days prior to the election when you can vote early. And all you should have to do is show up as long as you're registered to vote. People do need to remember to register to vote, and you have to do that 25 days in advance of an election here. But it should make things a lot better. We're still not where we need to be, but it will make things a lot more convenient for people who have to work on election day. And there'll be weekend time and evening time during the early voting period. So.
Now, one of the problems New Yorkers have encountered is that it's difficult to cast absentee ballots. Is that still the case, and if so, why?
It is. So as I mentioned, we saw a lot of progress in the legislature this session, and one of the things that we saw progress on was changing the rules for absentee ballots, but that is actually written into New York's Constitution.
That there are only a constitutional change.
Right, and so that'll take some time. So it passed for the first time a no-excuse absentee ballot, where you don't have to give a reason why. It passed for the first time this session, but it'll be another couple of years before that can become law.
Now, in 2016, which will go down in history as a notorious presidential election year, 200,000 names, if I have this correctly, were improperly purged from the voter rolls in New York City alone.
This is something we've written about at the Brennan Center and researched, is this problem of voter purges, and it's not just a problem in New York, but it's definitely a problem in New York. Elections administrators have a responsibility to maintain voter rolls, to make sure that people who move out of the location are removed from the rolls, people who die. But there are best practices and there are ways to do that where, you give notice to somebody so that if you're wrong, if you've matched the name incorrectly, they have a chance to say, no, I do still live here and I am still eligible to vote. And Brooklyn in particular, but the New York City Board of Elections had some really bad and frankly illegal practices in effect that didn't give people notice and just knocked, hundreds of thousands of people off the rolls. And it resulted in a lawsuit, and hopefully the problem's been fixed as a result of that. But it was certainly, I think, jarring to a lot of people living here who often do think of, the voter suppression efforts or problems with elections as being something from, the Deep South and not a problem that we have to deal with.
Exactly. Here. Why are things in such a mess in New York? Who's responsible?
Largely who's been responsible is the state legislature. And for a long time, the state legislature was basically in gridlock on any of these issues. And so we didn't see progress. And this year we saw a lot of progress, and a lot of things have changed. There's still some progress to make on automatic voter registration, on restoring voting rights to people on parole. But I think the fact that you just couldn't get an elections reform bill through the New York State legislature was the biggest issue. But we do also have a problem with elections administration. You know, it's not an easy thing to maintain voter rolls for a city the size of New York, but it's still a thing that has to happen, and we've obviously seen some mismanagement with regard to this voter purge that you brought up. And so I do think hopefully that issue activated a lot of people who are paying more attention to voting rights and elections now in New York, and I think the change in the legislature has really been the result of a broad movement, grassroots and advocacy movement in New York to try to push back against these things, and now the legislature is responding. So,
in our hyper-technological era, why is voting so difficult? In other words, you can shop online, you can bank online, you can do, I actually think that we've gone too far in terms of technology. But we're still, in many ways, backwards when it comes to voting. Why shouldn't you be able to register to vote and vote online and pretty much almost any time that you want to do it within some reasonable boundaries? Why shouldn't we do that?
I think we should be able to register online, and in most parts of this country you can. In New York there was until recently a way to do that through the DMV, but it was limited and only for folks that interact with the DMV. The budget in New York that passed this year included provisions for a more expanded online voter registration system, and so New York's starting to catch up with the rest of the country there. Voting online, I think there are serious security concerns, and we don't think that's a good idea. I mean, we all saw what the attempts of foreign governments to interfere with our election in 2016 and 2018, and so I think we need to be really wary of putting technology into that part of our elections. But in terms of the voter registration part, I think we could make a lot of progress.
One of the things that I think is really weird about New York, if I understand it, New York is the only state that holds its federal and state primaries on different days. Why?
Why is because New York's September primary historically did not provide enough time under federal law to get ballots out to overseas military voters in time for the November election. So the space between September and November was not enough for that to happen. And so the federal government forced New York through a lawsuit to move the federal primary back to June, or up to June, I should say. And the New York state legislature didn't want the state primary to be moved up to June, in part because the legislative session runs until June, and so they said we'll be campaigning at the same time as we're in the legislature.
Poor fellas.
So we had this bizarre system where we had a June federal primary and a September state primary. Thankfully, this is one of the things that the legislature did fix this year, and so moving forward, we will have a consolidated primary in June. And we won't have to worry about.
When does that start?
It starts next year. Well, I guess it technically starts this year, although most of the state isn't. We aren't having primary elections this year. We'll still have separate presidential primary and then the congressional and state legislative primary in June. That's actually something that happens in a number of states. So we're not as bad as we once were on this issue. But I think when you have so many, you could have a year in presidential year where you had 4 different election days. It depresses turnout, it confuses people, it causes all kinds of problems.
Right. So we've heard an awful lot about interference in elections related to social media. Mm-hmm. And we hear so much that a lot of people's eyes tend to glaze over. They don't understand what's going on. But are there some things, if you're just speaking to ordinary voters who are on social media, are there some things specifically that you would tell them to be careful of or to look out for or be concerned about?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've historically been worried about, and I think there's a reason to worry a little bit more about it now with the proliferation of social media, is deceptive practices and intimidation, people spreading false information about when election day is, how you can vote, where you can vote. You can vote by text, all of that kind of stuff. I would say there's a lot of really reliable information about how elections work available online at your Board of Elections website, et cetera. Don't take information about where and how and when to vote from Twitter. It's just not a reliable source on this. And for many years, it has been the case that there are people who try to mislead folks about when and how to vote in order to keep them from turning out. And I think social media allows not only for the proliferation of those messages, but also targeting. And that's always been the case with these deceptive practices, that they are targeted at populations that whoever is doing the targeting doesn't want to turn out.
And so you can show up ready to vote and find out that it's not election day.
Yeah.
That's horrible. If you were given the mandate to create a perfect voting system, you're our national voting czar, where would you start? What are some of the first steps that you would take?
I think I would, first of all, change the way voter registration works. And this is something we've seen progress on around the country, but I would create a system of automatic voter registration, which we now have in 15 states and Washington, D.C., and I would create a system with same-day registration, because that just gets rid of this first hurdle that people have to actually turning out and voting. People are politically motivated, they want to go vote, they show up, and they're not on the rolls. If you have a system where when people go to the DMV or various other state agencies, unless they affirmatively tell that agency, I don't want you to register me, their information is going to be used to register them, and that's automatic vote registration. But then you also have the fail-safe mechanism that if someone shows up on election day and they're not registered, they can get registered then and there. Then you just get rid of that first hurdle, which frankly does stop a lot of people. And then I would make voting as easy as I could as well. So make the voter registration easy and make the voting easy. Provide for a long period of early voting, long hours. Don't make a million different rules or requirements, whether it be voter ID law or bizarre requirements about changing your address. This is another thing New York just fixed. So if I move from one part of the state to another, I can show up and vote and I don't have to worry about the fact that I haven't changed my address. I think those would be the things that I would do in order to make voting as easy as possible. I'd get rid of the restrictions on people who were formerly convicted of a felony, on people who have outstanding legal financial obligations. And I would just let everyone who's a voting age citizen living in the world to vote. And then I would also take very seriously the concerns that we have about election security, to make sure that people's votes are counted and that we don't have to worry about influences from either within our country or outside our country that are impacting the way that an election turns out. And I would just try to fix all of these kinds of elections administration problems we have, because I think not only is it important that it's easy for people to vote and that people know how to and are well informed about it, but also that we can all feel very confident that our elections are, something that we can trust and believe in. And I think we can do that right now, but I think there are a lot of attempts by a lot of people, including, unfortunately, sometimes the president of our country, to make people not have faith in our democratic systems. And the best way you can, restore that faith is by having a well-functioning system that people interact with in a positive way.
We're going to stop there. Thank you so much, Sean Morales-Doyle. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. We keep being told that the economy is not just doing well, but fabulously well. Unemployment is as low as it's been in half a century. Inflation has faded almost out of sight, and the high rollers have ridden the stock market in recent years to remarkable heights. So why aren't more Americans happier with their economic situation? The short answer is that for a lot of Americans, there is little to be happy about. Wages for a vast swath of American workers are pitifully low. Benefits are few. Many of the jobs that so many of the politicians are crowing about are part-time. An indication of how tough the economy is for a lot of us is the large percentage of Americans who are working well past the normal or traditional retirement age. Part of the reason is because we're healthier than prior generations, and that's a good thing. But a bigger reason is that too few Americans are able to put away the money they need to finance a secure and comfortable retirement. The financial magazine Barron's summed up the matter in blunt terms. The ugly, unspoken truth is that many people are just not earning enough money. They barely have enough to cover their daily expenses. They don't have enough left over to be able to save. In fact, as of 2017, the Federal Reserve reports that 41% of American households could not easily cover a $400 emergency expense. When money's that tight, a retirement fund of any kind can be completely out of reach. Despite the rosy employment numbers, fully a third of full-time workers have no access to a retirement plan at their job, and that percentage rises to 2/3 for part-time workers. Social Security is a bare-bones safety net solution for many, but it's not enough to ward off a long and painful old age for millions of our workers. Only a revised, fairer, more equitable distribution of the benefits from this booming economy will do that. That's all for now. See you next time.